people here as panelists. My job is really just to ask questions and lead the discussion. And I religiously don't believe that I should read bios that we've already sent to you, but you'll see just if you look at each of their backgrounds, they're extraordinarily successful. And what's particularly helpful is that both of them have been on both sides of the fence. They've both been very successful as senior executives at major pharmaceutical biotech companies, and both are currently CEOs of biotech companies. So they understand well from being on both sides of the fence what has changed over time and so forth. I'll just start out and say the reason why this is an interesting topic is it really the relation really has changed a lot. When I was at J. Whitney and they made the investment in Genetics Institute, biotech could not operate just by itself. It's very heavily dependent on sales forces of big pharma, and to a certain extent, strategic partnerships on the regulatory side. But things have changed, and we're gonna talk about that, and they keep changing, right? As the shift to orphan drugs shifted the relationship. The shift away from orphan drugs changing. So it'll be very interesting to. I've asked the panelists to not only talk about where things stand today and where they might go in the future, but also give a bit of a historical perspective as well, because I'm a strong believer that history tells you a lot also about the future, right? So with that, let's start out and just say, ask each of you to comment and just say, what's your view of how it has changed, over the last couple of decades? And by the way, my rule is I don't force people to answer every question, and I don't force what order. So they'll just answer and speak when they feel like it.
All right. I'll start. I think Peter, I think you said it really well. What started 20, 30 years ago has changed. Biotech companies were not commercializing stuff themselves. They were always working with partners, et cetera, and that definitely has changed. What I think has not changed so much has been the kind of ecosystem of, I kind of likened it, biotech companies being kind of the innovative, almost like independent filmmakers, and the large pharma companies being the distributors of those films. And certainly big pharma companies have come up with their own amazing drugs as well, and some biotech, well, a lot of biotech companies have not always been so successful, but I think that what has not changed and has been relatively steady has been this kind of relationship between biotech and pharma, where I think each side needs one another. Then you throw into the mix the whole funding environment, whether it's venture capital or public company capital, taking a company all the way through to full commercialization. My own current company is a small public company. We've got a small molecule in type 1 diabetes, reduced hypoglycemic events, and we should have data by the end of next year in phase 3. And I went to our investors and said, my intent would be sell the company at that point. And interestingly, some of the investors said, well, we might want to put in a lot more money and have you take it all the way through to full commercialization and put a sales force together and all that kind of thing. So that you didn't used to hear as much as you do now. So I think that's one big difference as well.
Yeah. Nice for time.
Yeah, so I only joined pharma from a career in academia before that in 2014. So I'll comment more from the 2014 on. So I used to be the head of Roche Pharma Research Early Development. Oversaw a unit of about 2,400 people based in Basel, which has a global footprint. We did early discovery. And the reason I bring that up is that I think even over the last 10 years, 11 years, what has been remarkable is just how much more is even being done in biotech. So, we had a huge army of folks who did protein engineering. In chemistry, we had less and we outsourced a lot, but protein engineering, I think in particular, has really changed a lot. It's now become commoditized. So for example, now I have a biotech, we're still in stealth mode, so I won't say much, but we only have 10 people. But we can work with CROs to make biologics that are sophisticated, very cutting edge, and so on and so forth, and we don't need the internal group at pharma. I specifically remember Roche PRED talking to our therapeutic modalities folks about like, well, shouldn't we be doing more? And they're like, oh no, no one's going to be able to replicate what we can do in-house. And this is a group that made bispecific. We made glofitamab, which was just approved for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's a 2x1 CD20, CD3 bispecific, very sophisticated engineering. But now that's been commoditized, and you can make not only bispecifics but trispecifics and so on and so forth. So I think that's one area that's in particularly changed, just in the span that I've been in pharma. And then the other one is China, and then we're going to talk about China later. But a lot of this commoditization has actually happened because of the CROs in China, essentially, where you can have, I know another company that has like 6 people, but basically through chemistry efforts in China have been brought a molecule into phase 1, very lean and so on and so forth. So I think that's going to change dramatically as the future comes along, and we're going to talk about that. The other point is that I do think that pharma still, though, has a big role to play in really making transformative breakthrough molecules. One advantage of pharma is that you hopefully will have the time and the steady resources to really work on big problems. And when I say that, for example, the bispecific emicizumab, which is a molecule for hemophilia A that was made by Chugai, that's actually in my book, we'll talk about it later, but they screened 44,000 molecules to come up with this final bispecific molecule. I don't think in a biotech, the investors would have the patience over 10 years to do that kind of thing. Or Roche PRED, we just made, just went to phase 3, but we made the brain shuttle gantenerumab molecule. This is a molecule for Alzheimer's disease where scientists spent 10 years tinkering on how to make antibodies go to the brain better through transferrin receptors. So hopefully big pharma can really still tackle the big problems while biotech innovates on shorter cycles.
So, let's go, if we go back, let's focus a little on the history again. If we go back and dial back, there was a point in time where suddenly things went in favor of the biotech companies. One, because they started inventing a lot of things. 2, because there was a resurgence of orphan drugs. And obviously, if you have orphan drugs, the need for a big sales force changes, right? Because if there are 4 research centers that are pretty much it, you don't need big pharma sales force. The other, though, on the financial side, and this is why financial is, there was a hot IPO market for a number of years. So they didn't need big pharma for the money. They didn't need big pharma if they were doing orphan drugs for the sales force. And then, as you said, on the back end, in terms of CROs, so that they got a lot of relatively low cost help on that end, which often they would depend on big pharma for. The other flip side of that, and Fred Hassan, who was here in this audience, told that story once. For a period of time, big pharma kind of lost their mojo, right? And they were really struggling to invent things. Now they turn things around. But the confluence of all those things suddenly put biotech in a more powerful position, both financially, because then they could go for a lot longer without having to sell themselves out, but also in terms of what their needs are. But do you think that has changed at all, those dynamics? Because those dynamics were true for about 8-10 years or something like that. Do you see a shift between that scenario where it was really very good for biotech, right, to today?
I think we have seen a shift. The other comment I wanted to make, what William just said, which I totally agree with, prior to my current company, I was CEO of a company called eGenesis, which is a transplantation company. That's a company that on one hand, a big pharma wouldn't start that project, I think, right? And in fact, Novartis did, and I was in charge of it, and they abandoned it. But when a company like eGenesis has made certain progress, and now, there was an article, I think, in the newspaper in the Times today that was talking about that this is likely to become a reality versus just, could this actually really work? But you're gonna absolutely need big pharma at that point, in my opinion, I don't care how much money or how, you go public from CMC to distribution to, I mean, that's now a super complex problem, right? So I think there's still, that's what I like about biotech, when the biotech can handle or can tackle really huge problems, but ultimately the really huge problems that are so complex are going to be needed. You're going to need big pharma to like take it from there. Right?
Yeah, so coming back to then, I think what you're asking, has it changed? Yeah, so, I mean, particularly during COVID, we know there's basically like a bubble with a lot of biotechs getting formed and getting tons of cash, where I think the emphasis now, my understanding, a lot of those are underwater, for example, from the last 3 years, and it's been much harder to fundraise, for example. And at least what I see right now is the climate is a lot of VCs are really interested in clinical ready assets. Not so much investing in the long-term platform anymore, where there's maybe 5, 10 years ago, it's more about platforms and the promise of what that could do. Now it's really a focus on, if you have a development candidate, can you get a molecule and get clinical data in, say, 2 to 3 years? And then, that can lead to a faster multiple for the VC that's investing. I think that's also why you see people going to China then, where the development is on targets that are already out there and clinically validated. If you want to iterate on those, then those are easier to have clinically ready assets to actually develop.
I think that the platform product thing it's a real fine line, right? Because on both sides, when I've been on the VC side, we say, like, you want to have an asset that's ready to go to the clinic, but then what do you have behind that? And they're like, well, we just have that asset that, so like, okay, well, we really would like you to have a pipeline and, and then a platform that you can build on that. And then if you say, okay, but the platform is going to require this amount of money, et cetera, they're like, okay, well, we just want you to take the asset forward, right? So it's like, it's really fine line. It's a difficult balance to achieve. And that's one of the things that I've seen, like with some of my companies where I've been on the board, that is, that we really struggle to. Are we a platform company? Are we a product company? Or are we someplace in the middle? Or do we have a potential platform that we could kind of like ramp up if we've got the funding for it and putting all the money into the single asset? And there are some VCs, right, to your point, that are just saying, like, what a single asset company will just, build it, sell it, and then move on to the next thing. So I think that's another change.
Yeah, actually, Paul, your comment just leads logically to another question, which is, does the answer to the question of what's the relationship between biotech pharma depend heavily on what you're inventing? In other words, like you mentioned, platform versus and so forth, but also depending upon what therapeutic area you are. Because depending upon what therapeutic area you are, what your needs are can be quite different, whether they're CMC or regulatory or sales force or whatever. On top of which, you're mentioning VCs are very important in the public market because your relationship could change depending upon what VCs want to do, right? I mean, platform was the vogue for a while, and then it became, the pariah, whatever. So if you were unlucky and you happened to decide to start a platform and it shifted away, suddenly what your needs are and what you could do and how much you would have to lean on big pharma would change. So with that, walk us through some of your thoughts about how different therapeutic areas or different, strategies change the relationship with big pharma.
Yeah, I think that's, we can comment on that as well. I think that's a really important question. For example, in my current company, I just mentioned the asset that we have that's in phase 3, but we also have an oral GLP-1 that has actually no patent life left on it, but we get calls like every week from a company saying, like, could we take a look at your oral GLP-1? And we always say, well, we don't have any patent life left on it. They're like, well, we can figure that out later because the whole metabolic space is just red hot right now. I mean, I was just looking at some numbers earlier today that I mean, by 2030, they're saying the GLP market should be selling around $90 billion a year, something like that, right? I mean, it's really, really crazy. So, I mean, I think that's an important thing. What do you have that you're developing? I think not the me too, but let's say the next best generation of a drug that has already proven itself, I think is very, very high, as well as early stage, not known targets, or difficult druggable targets as well, but it's a completely different, I mean, I'd love to hear your comments on when you were at Roche for that, to look at working with, early stage companies versus the ones that, were sure to work, but that were, much later as well.
Yeah, for the first comment, I would just say that, every decade, the top 10 drugs in pharma are different in terms of therapeutic area. So that just has to do with the science and what's emerging at the time. It might be neuroscience one decade, then oncology, it's been for a while now, it's obviously metabolism, and probably immunology. So if you happen to be lucky that your molecules can either pivot to those areas, or you're already working in those areas in terms of timing, then I think you're well positioned. That's not to say that if you're in a not-hot area, you shouldn't keep going, but it might be a harder slog to raise money and so on and so forth. Yeah, I mean, I think for pharma, there's a couple of strategies that you can do, right? If you're working totally on new targets, then the probability of technical success can go down. But then if you're working on validated targets, you better be great at execution and make sure that your molecule is differentiated. So yeah, always have to balance on that, and obviously keep an eye on what's going on in competition. And there are companies that as soon as they see some company has clinically validated data, then they throw all the resources on that particular molecule and so on and so forth. But you have to be in the game.
We would be in the game.
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. I mean, if you do focus a lot on strategy and business structure and business model, this is a fascinating question, right? And the thing that's clear that both of you have given a lot of thought to what your business is and who you should depend on and not depend on, and in what order. And I encourage everyone in the audience here and virtually to do the same thing, which is take a big step back and look at the big picture and say, all right, let me look at the nature of the business I'm in, what area I'm in, is it popular or not popular with big pharma or the public markets or the VCs, and just say, look, I can't change the big picture, so I just got to make sure my strategy, financial and business strategy, fits reality, right? And if it doesn't, then you got to change it, right? So that's interesting. One question is this: there's been a lot of turmoil related to funding of NIH and research at universities and so forth, and it's had a big impact on research and drug development in the industry. Do you feel that some of the changes, which we don't know how long this will prevail, we don't know whether it'll shift back, 3 years from now. Anyone who says that they can break that is probably a little bit out of their mind. But what impact do you feel the current administration funding, strategies, et cetera, and revamping the FDA have on this issue between the relationship between biotech and big pharma?
Well, I feel very strongly about this one, regardless of politics.
He grabbed the mic. Did you see that?
Which is basically no research today, no cures tomorrow. And I think you really need a steady funding situation. Scientists need to have a steady environment and know that they can invest in true basic science questions. I think the biggest breakthroughs come through fundamental questions being asked by curious scientists who are actually just interested in nature, not necessarily interested in making a drug, to be honest. I mean, nowadays that's changed. But the really big breakthroughs come from those curious scientists, and those folks need to have their funding. And I think what's happening is a tragedy. I think the US biomedical system is the best in the world, has been the best in the world, but it's not a guarantee that it will always be that. And I think we should all be very worried about that. I do think from a pharma side, pharma's not gonna make up the $50 billion investment from NIH, because the short-term market and everything, they're not gonna invest in those basic science questions. So I'm a little worried about who's gonna invest in that. And we already do see scientists going to other countries, and then we also know there's other countries investing like 5% of their GDP in life sciences. So I'm very worried for the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm also worried both on the biotech side and the pharma side of the kind of exodus, I don't want to say mass exodus, but the exodus of FDA, and like the second that suddenly PDUFA dates are going to start being missed, that's going to be a big problem, right? I mean, because we all rely on FDA for, I mean, that could disrupt, that could disrupt business in our industry for a long time, if that actually really happens. I mean, I think so far we haven't seen too much of that yet, but it doesn't mean that it can't happen. And I mean, good people are leaving quickly, so that's the other worry.
Yeah, related to that, I just got an email. There's another, Peter Kolshinsky is actually doing a survey of biotechs. I can send the link along on how people are feeling about that.
Yeah, I totally agree with both of you. I mean, I think it's kind of tragic. The sad thing is if you look at the big picture, the US has maybe 3 to 6 industries that are crown jewels, right? Oddly enough, it's not all technology. I mean, we are without question the leader in agriculture, right? We have the lowest cost farms, whatever, in the world, so it's not just technology. And the drug industry is one of our crown jewels. So the sad thing is a lot of these changes are really going to contribute to our losing our leadership position. And the other is that if they just suddenly change next year, a lot of damage is permanent. I mean, I know, I won't mention name, but a leading, virologist and, so forth, and, with this funding cut and then the DOGE, whatever, he was doing a long-term monkey, testing, so they couldn't tell him what was happening. And when they finally told him, they said, well, I'm sorry, they're gone. And if the funding comes back, you can't revive, those monkeys are gone, right? So it's kind of sad. By the way, I want to remind the virtual audience and also the in-person audience that we'd like your questions. And if you are here in person, just raise your hand and step up to the little X there and ask your questions so that the audience can, virtual audience and in-person could hear. And if you're virtual, raise your hand and we'll put you on the stage and so that people can see you and you can ask your question. So,
Can I add one thing?
Please go
You
ahead.
can tell I feel strongly about this. But yeah, I'm an adjunct professor at Cornell in the Department of Pharmacology. And in the first year PhD students, there's less than half that last year. And then Harvard just cut 75% of their PhDs. They didn't even make the news. Yeah, so. Yeah.
And by the way, history really is very important. Actually, if you go back, I find it fascinating, if you go back to history of the pharmaceutical industry, it's dramatically changed. By the way, 100 years ago, all the pharmaceutical businesses were part of chemical companies because it was a chemical process and that's how you did it. And so, Dow, DuPont, Bayer, all those guys, they were the big pharma. But as it shifted and the methodology changed, and biotech methods come in, it shifted and it evolved, right? And still, some are still in it, but it's really evolved, and it's going to continue to evolve, right?
You remember all the chemical companies like in Basel sat along the river, so that.
Yeah, that's right.
No, exactly. So, and it is important to think about history because not all history repeats itself, but there are some lessons from history that one could apply today, in thinking.